Israel thought it knew what a bad night looked like. Then came the kind of night that changes the mood of an entire country. Not because people in Tel Aviv had never heard sirens before, not because Israel had never faced missiles before, but because there are moments in a conflict when the fear stops feeling distant, stops feeling manageable, stops feeling like something happening at the edge of the map, and suddenly feels personal, immediate, and close enough to hear through the walls. That is what makes a night like this so dark. It is not just the explosions. It is not just the images. It is not just the damage. It is the psychological snap. The moment people realize this is no longer a story they are watching, it is a story they are living inside. And that is why this matters far beyond one night, one barrage, or one headline. Because when Iranian missile attacks reach into Israel's core and force cities like Tel Aviv and Ophir, the whole calculation changes. The illusion of distance disappears. The illusion of control gets tested. And the illusion that escalation can stay neatly contained starts falling apart in real time. AP's recent coverage describes continuing Iranian missile and drone strikes on Israel, including Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, as the war broadens across the region. AP News, too. That is the first thing to understand. The real story is not just that missiles were fired. The real story is that every new barrage is trying to achieve something bigger than physical destruction. It is trying to break rhythm, break confidence, break the ordinary feeling of daily life. It is trying to force a country built on readiness to confront the one thing readiness can never fully erase: vulnerability. And that word matters, because Israel's entire security identity is built on the promise that vulnerability can be managed, reduced, and answered faster than its enemies can exploit it. That promise is not just military. It is emotional. It is political. It is part of the national story. So when the sky over central Israel turns into another night of incoming fire, the question is no longer just whether defenses intercept enough missiles. The question is what repeated nights like this do to the public mind, what they do to families, what they do to markets, what they do to the sense that tomorrow will still feel normal. That is where darkness really lives in a war like this. Not only in impact zones, in anticipation, in the wait between siren and blast, in the silence after an alert, in the look people give each other when they already know they are not sleeping tonight. And this is where a lot of outside coverage misses the point. People see footage. They see flashes. They see buildings. They see numbers. They see the military map. What they do not always see is what a society feels like when tension becomes routine. Because routine fear does not always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it looks like people checking their phones too often, children learning what shelter routes look like, parents pretending their voice is calmer than it is, a city trying to function while knowing the next interruption could come at any moment. That is not just war. That is war sinking into civilian time. And when that happens in Tel Aviv, it hits differently. Because Tel Aviv is not just another city on a map. It is a symbol of normalcy, commerce, nightlife, technology, ambition, and civilian energy. When that kind of city is dragged deeper into the rhythm of incoming missiles, the message is bigger than military retaliation. The message is that nowhere important feels untouchable anymore. That is what gives a night like this its weight. Not just what was struck, what was shaken. And here is the hard truth. In a conflict this volatile, even a successful interception-heavy night does not feel like victory to ordinary people. It feels like survival. That is a huge difference. Survival is not the same emotional experience as safety. It is not the same political experience as control. It is not the same strategic experience as deterrence. That is why these nights accumulate. One night becomes two. Two becomes a pattern. The pattern becomes pressure. And pressure changes everything. It changes the way leaders talk. It changes the way enemies calculate. It changes the way civilians judge what their government is promising them. And it changes the way the outside world starts asking whether this conflict is escalating faster than anyone can meaningfully contain. That concern is not abstract anymore. AP reports that the war has widened beyond Israel and Iran themselves, drawing in more regional actors, disrupting civilian infrastructure, and intensifying fears over a broader Middle East crisis. AP News 1. That is the second thing people need to understand. A night like this does not stay inside one city. It ripples outward, into diplomacy, into markets, into oil, into alliances, into the political future of every leader claiming they can control the temperature. Because every barrage creates two battles at once: the visible battle in the sky and the invisible battle over credibility. Can Israel say it still has the initiative? Can Iran say it is proving deterrence through retaliation? Can Washington say the situation is still manageable? Can anybody say this ends soon and sound believable? That is where this story becomes more than a military update. It becomes a test of narratives. Everybody involved wants the public to believe they still control the terms. But nights like this expose how fragile that claim can look when missiles are still flying, civilians are still sheltering, and each side is trying to turn endurance into proof of strength. And endurance is a dangerous currency, because the longer a crisis lasts, the more every side starts calling pain resilience and instability strategy. That is when wars become hardest to stop, not when nobody is suffering. When everybody is suffering, but nobody wants to be the first to admit that escalation is now producing more fear than leverage. That is why a dark night in Tel Aviv matters far beyond Tel Aviv. It tells you the conflict is no longer operating on the old assumption that pain can be kept selective and controlled. The center of gravity has shifted. The emotional zone has widened. The domestic consequences are harder to hide. And once that happens, every new strike carries more than tactical meaning. It carries political meaning. So what does a night like this do inside Israel? First, it hardens anger. That is the immediate reaction in any country under fire. Anger at the attacker. Anger at the danger. Anger at the fact that ordinary people are being forced into the timetable of war. Second, it deepens exhaustion. And that part matters just as much. Because war fatigue is not softness. It is the human cost of living too long inside emergency mode. A society can be determined and drained at the same time. Third, it raises the stakes for leadership. Because every promise sounds different after a bad night. Every claim about deterrence sounds different. Every vow about security sounds different. Citizens do not just ask whether leaders sound strong. They ask whether the nights are getting better or worse. That is where political pressure starts to build. And once political pressure builds in a crisis this dangerous, leaders often face the worst possible temptation. Do something bigger, louder, and harsher to prove control. That is the trap. Because sometimes escalation is sold as clarity. In reality, it can become a confession that the previous round did not settle anything. That is the third thing to understand. A night like this does not just reveal vulnerability. It creates pressure for overreaction. And that is when conflicts become even more unstable. Iran wants nights like this to prove that Israel can still be reached, still be rattled, still be forced to feel costs in its own urban core. Israel, in turn, wants to show that every attack only justifies a harsher response and deeper resolve. But when both sides are trying to turn pain into proof, the public ends up trapped inside a cycle where every side calls the next blow necessary. That is how dark nights multiply. And the human reality inside that cycle is brutal. AP's recent reporting describes growing casualties, infrastructure damage, displacement, and the expansion of military activity across multiple fronts. AP News 1, which brings us to the point a lot of hot take coverage avoids. There is a difference between a country looking strong and a country feeling secure. They are not the same, not even close. A state can retaliate with overwhelming force and still have civilians lying awake at night. A military can intercept large numbers of incoming threats and still fail to restore the feeling of normal life. A government can promise victory and still face a population measuring reality in sirens, shelters, and interrupted sleep. That is why the phrase darkest night hits people so hard. Because darkness in war is not always defined by the worst body count or the most dramatic footage. Sometimes it is defined by the collapse of confidence. The moment a city built around movement, energy, and routine is forced into the slow, ugly psychology of waiting for impact. And for an American audience, that is the part worth paying attention to. Not because America is directly living this exact experience, but because this is what modern escalation looks like when deterrence starts breaking down. It is not clean. It is not contained. It is not cinematic in the way politicians pretend. It is a rolling crisis where civilians absorb uncertainty night after night, while leaders keep insisting the next move will restore control. Maybe, but maybe not. That is the fear now hanging over this conflict. Not just that another barrage will come, That another barrage will come and still not answer the deeper question of where any of this is actually going. Because if Tel Aviv can be dragged repeatedly into nights like this, if the region keeps widening, if the diplomacy stays weak, and if both sides keep treating endurance as victory, then darkness stops being a metaphor. It becomes the operating condition. And that is what makes this moment so dangerous. Not just the missiles, the momentum, the sense that each side believes it can still impose clarity through pressure, even as pressure keeps producing something else entirely. More instability, more fear, more exhaustion, and a wider regional crisis with no clean off-ramp in sight. AP reports that mediation efforts are still underway, but the fighting has continued amid rejected proposals and counter-demands. AP News 1. So the real question after a night like this is not whether it was bad. Of course it was bad. The real question is whether nights like this are becoming the new rhythm of the war. Because if they are, then this is not just about one barrage over Tel Aviv. It is about a conflict entering a darker phase, where fear becomes routine, retaliation becomes automatic, and every side keeps talking like it still has time to control the spiral. That is what people should be watching. Not just the explosions, the pattern, not just the damage, the direction. Because a country can survive a dark night. A region can survive a dark night. What becomes harder to survive is a string of dark nights that keep teaching everyone the same lesson. This war is getting easier to start again than to stop.